Some of the most brutal punishments in history originated in China. Until the 20th century, the so-called 5 punishments were at the heart of China's relentless punitive system. These punishments were, quote, intense, irreversible, and brief, end quote, and functioned as carefully staged public spectacles of violence, designed to deter others through their cruelty. In this video, we explore how China perfected the art of corporal punishment and how exactly the 5 punishments worked. The Book of Documents, one of the oldest and most important documents from ancient China, reports that the Yellow Emperor, one of the 5 mythical emperors, adopted the 5 punishments from the San Miao clan in his search for a fair penal system. So, although the origins of the 5 punishments lie in the realm of mythology, their use in China was quite real. Already in use in ancient China by the Warring States period, or the early Imperial era at the latest, they had evolved into a complex system of punishment covering almost all areas of life, from administration to family. In their original form, they included branding by tattooing, amputation of the nose and ear or one or both legs, castration, and the death penalty. Over time, the use of mutilation punishments gradually declined, until they were abolished by Emperor Han Wendi in 167 BC. This was controversial at his court, because some were afraid that other punishments would be too lenient, causing chaos to break out. Castration was the last punishment to be abandoned in 220 AD. Nevertheless, the 5 punishments remained quite brutal, but were, as sinologist Klaus Mühlhahn describes, quote, less severe, less irreversible, and less short, end quote. Beatings and compulsory labor were introduced to replace mutilations. These punishments were considered more suitable because criminals, who were not completely disfigured, could reintegrate into society, and because China's rulers discovered that convicts made excellent cheap labor. The emperors of the Tang dynasty finally had the entire penal system laid down in a code. This was very important because in the Chinese worldview, which had been strongly influenced by the teaching of Confucius since the Zhou dynasty, every criminal act was a disturbance in the balance of the cosmos. The ruler, as the representative of divine power on earth, based on the so-called mandate of heaven, was responsible for restoring this balance, thus preventing chaos and unrest from gaining the upper hand. However, this was only possible if the punishments were just and appropriate, so that no new imbalance arose. For this reason, the legal code of the Tang dynasty assigned an appropriate punishment to each offense, leaving as little room as possible for human error. The Tang Code shaped Chinese law for the rest of the imperial period, and both the Ming and the Qing based their legal systems on it. In the last form, which was used until 1911, the 5 punishments consisted of beatings with a bamboo rod, beating with a large stick, penal servitude, exile, and the death penalty. A square or large crossroad was usually chosen as the setting for the public administration of the punishments. There was no scaffold or spectacular staging though. To ensure that everything was carried out as fairly as possible, the execution was closely monitored by the authorities, with the trial only concluding when the accused confessed to the crime. Torture was often used to obtain a confession. Those who admitted to their crime immediately received a more lenient sentence. There were various degrees of all 5 of the punishments. For beatings with the rod, for example, the judge could choose between 5 levels, specifying between 10 and 15 lashes on the buttocks. Forced labor and banishment were usually combined with a beating to increase disgrace and enhance the deterrent effect. Those sentenced to compulsory labor had to perform hard physical work no one else wanted to, typically in mining, salt harvesting, or construction. For example, convicts were responsible for much of the construction and maintenance work on the Great Wall of China. Even those sent into exile had to work. Convicts were often deployed in dangerous border areas and military outposts far from home, such as Manchuria, Mongolia, and Xinjiang, where they were required to take on difficult and sometimes dangerous tasks. During the Qing dynasty in particular, a so-called military exile was often imposed, in which the convict had to perform military service in the most dangerous border regions. If the exile did particularly well, he may be considered rehabilitated, while if he failed to achieve a specified goal, he received additional punishment. The most severe of all punishments was the death penalty, usually carried out by beheading or strangulation. The death sentence was typically postponed until the next court session, allowing time for the sentence to be reviewed. All death sentences had to be approved by a central authority in Beijing and the emperor himself. Only in the case of particularly serious offenses was the offender executed immediately. In such cases, other methods of execution were sometimes used, such as the infamous death by 1,000 cuts. This terrible punishment, in which the executioner cut the flesh of the condemned person piece by piece, was reserved for the worst crimes, such as treason, patricide, or the mutilation of a living person. These offenses were among the so-called 10 abominations, the 10 crimes that were considered the worst threat to society. The first 3 of these were punishable by death. In particularly serious cases of these crimes, the justice system even punished the families of the perpetrators. For example, because it was assumed that a conspiracy was impossible without confidence, the convicted person's father and sons were also strangled. His brothers, grandfathers, and concubines and servants were sold as slaves, and all his female relatives were sent into exile. The Chinese penal system was merciless, but it was not indiscriminately brutal. It considered, for example, whether an act had been committed deliberately or whether the perpetrator was sane. In addition, certain groups of people were generally treated more leniently. For example, high mobility members of the Imperial family, people over 90, children under 7, and women. Young, old, and disabled people were excluded from corporal punishment and torture. They could make amends for all but the most serious crimes by paying a fine. Fines alone were not used as punishment, nor was prison, which merely served as a form of secure accommodation, while the accused awaited trial or the execution of a sentence. Conversely, a judge could increase a sentence he considered too lenient. This was often the case for repeat offenders. A popular additional punishment was the so-called wooden collar. This construction of heavy wooden blocks usually weighed almost 15 kilograms and was placed around the offender's neck for days, weeks, or sometimes even months. Tattooing of the forearm and face was also used as an additional punishment. This was particularly common for robbers, grave robbers, and those who failed to abide by their exile. The first time the offense was tattooed on the right forearm, the second time on the left, and the third time on the face. The criminal was thus permanently branded. When China's last emperor, Pu Yi, abdicated on February 12, 1912, the era of the 5 punishments came to an end. The newborn Republic of China found other, albeit no less brutal, methods of maintaining law and order.